Hi everyone, I'm your host, Dr. Victoria Williams, and welcome to this fun and interactive webinar series, Inspiring South African Women of Neuroscience, hosted by Neural, where we'll be talking about all things neuroscience, from research, careers, and studies in the neurosciences. We will start with an informal discussion with the women on the panel, which will be followed by a Q&A session. And during the Q&A session, you're welcome to either post questions on the chats or simply raise your hand and you'll be unmuted. And we really are encouraging everyone who has questions to ask to make this fun and interactive. So please don't be shy, ask questions. Okay, great. So let's get right into it and begin. Let me introduce you to each of the women on the panel. So first off, we have Kate Cockcroft, who is a professor of psychology at Wits University, where she teaches in disciplines including neuroscience and developmental psychology. She is also my mentor for my postdoctoral research in psychology, and she's the division leader of cognitive neuroscience at Wits Neural. Welcome, Kate. Then we have psychiatrist Soraya Sidat, who is a professor of psychiatry and executive head of the Department of Psychiatry at Stellenbosch University. She has more than 20 years of clinical and basic neuroscience research as a psychiatrist, where she specializes in traumatic stress and anxiety. And she has published over 450 peer-reviewed academic papers. Neuropsychologist and social neuroscientist, Dr. Saba Bezrati, will also be joining us today. And she's a senior lecturer in cognitive neuroscience at the Department of Psychology at Wits. And she's also a global scholar in the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which is awarded to outstanding early career researchers who have been recognized as both rising stars in their field of research, as well as up and coming leaders in their area of expertise. And she is also the co-founder and joint leader of Wits Neural. Welcome, Saba. And neuroanatomist Dr. Jordan Swigers will also be joining us today. She recently graduated with her PhD in anatomical sciences at Wits University. Big congratulations for this. Her and I spent many hours in the research lab at Anatomy dissecting brains together. So she feels like part of the family now. And she teaches second year medical and health sciences students at the School of Anatomical Sciences at Wits. And she's also been awarded a postdoctoral fellowship in Canada, in Quebec. And she's actually leaving on Tuesday. So I'm hoping she'll tell us a little bit more about what this research involves. And last but by no means least, we have Urvashi Maganlal, who is a dual registered clinical neuropsychologist and clinical psychologist. And she works with patients afflicted by neurocognitive and neurodegenerative disorders using both clinical and standardized neuropsychological assessment tools. And she also has experience lecturing and brings with her a deeper understanding of neuroscience beyond its clinical applications. So I'm sure you're all very excited and intrigued to hear more about how one becomes a neuroscientist. I'd like to open questions up to the panel. What did you study?
So thanks, Vicky. I'll kick this one off and get started. But I'm not going to go first each time. So I did most of my studies at Wits. I completed a PhD in developmental neuroscience. And in fact, I was supervised by a professor of cognitive ergonomics. So that's actually organizational psychology, because there wasn't anyone available in my field at the time. So it was quite an interesting PhD. And prior to that, I did 2 masters, one in research psychology and one in educational psychology. And in addition, I've done all sorts of bits of extra training in neuroscience related topics. So I've done a course in neuroanatomy and neurophysiology through the Wits School of Anatomy and Physiology. I also did a course in neuroanatomy and advanced neuroanatomy and advanced neurophysiology at Bangor University in Wales, and a fellowship in neuroimaging at Harvard University. And I think one of the things with neuroscience is because it's such a fast developing field, it's really important to stay up to date with current methodologies. So it's important to constantly keep your skills current and update them. Yeah, so that's my background. I don't know if you have any questions, Vicky, or should we?
That's fantastic. Thank you, Kate.
I don't mind going next. So I have quite an interesting background in the sense that I didn't come from psychology. I actually studied at Wits in the late 80s and early 90s, and actually did my first degree in chemistry and biochemistry. And I only started neuropsychology, actually I came to Wits Plus, which is the night school or part-time program at Wits. And at that time, she was almost 40 years old when I started with an undergraduate, and subsequently just became enamored with cognitive neuroscience. I'd been involved in the corporate arena in terms of sensory science. I worked for a and fragrance company, and we looked at sort of emotional-based processing and buying behavior and buying decision making, which is now, at that time it was called behavioral psychology, not really behavioral neuroscience. It's an area that's outside. If anybody wants to get involved in neuroscience, you don't actually have a clinical arena because it spans into economics, it spans into marketing, so many different areas. But I subsequently completed the neuropsychology program at Wits. In fact, Kate was one of my lecturers at the time, and look back since. And yeah, that's weird. So there's other routes into getting into neuropsychology is what I'm trying to say, besides the straightforward traditional route.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. It's very interesting to hear about behavioral sciences and the applications in the broader neurosciences. Thank you.
So I can go third. I'm Soraya Sidat, and I studied medicine at the University of Natal many, many decades ago, and then specialized in psychiatry. And in fact, at the time, I was torn between specializing in pediatrics and psychiatry. And I thought, well, I'll give psychiatry a shot because my heart is really in pediatrics. But it was just too difficult to leave psychiatry, and I don't regret my decision. In fact, it's the best decision I could have made. Then on completing my specialization in psychiatry, I was also torn then with going into clinical medicine, so clinical psychiatry, or working full-time as a researcher. And I was fortunate at the time to receive an MRC postdoctoral fellowship, and that led to a number of other research opportunities and fellowships. And I think what really changed the trajectory of my career was spending some time abroad at the University of California, San Diego, on a research fellowship under the supervision and mentorship of another psychiatrist, Professor Murray Steen, who was an expert and is still really a world-renowned figure in the field of anxiety disorders. And I became particularly interested in anxiety and how environmental experiences such as traumatic experiences, but just, everyday life stresses, particularly stresses that begin in childhood, impact on the brain and as well as impact on behavior. And over time, I have pursued that line of research because it is so important when one manages patients with mental illness. Mental illnesses are by and large very complex illnesses in terms of their etiology. And as a neuroscientist, one really needs to, buckle down, and you need to be comprehensive in your research approach and investigation, because there is a very complex interplay between biological and environmental factors in the genesis of these conditions. So that's how I've landed up where I am currently today.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I'll be asking you more about your research in a moment. Thank you. Jordan, can you tell us a bit more about what you studied?
So I also have a very different background. I started my studies off in biomedical engineering, and then without completing that, I moved into a BSc and I majored in human biology and physiology. And during that, in your last block of that, those majors, you do like a mini research project, and my research project that I chose just happened to be with Dr. Busi Maseko, who's talking in the next session. And from there, she asked if I was going to do my honors. I hadn't even really thought about that. And she offered me the project that she was putting forward. So I moved into BHSC Human Biology Honors. And from there, MSc, and then upgraded to my PhD. And this year I finally decided to go back, and I've just got word that, well, not just, but about a week ago, got word that I passed my outstanding course on my biomedical engineering. So I finished that too now. But yeah,
Wow.
so thank you. My trip into neuroscience was almost by accident. I never really officially planned to go into it. But yeah, I found my little niche, and now I'm going to do my postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Sherbrooke in Canada, in Quebec. And I'm going to be doing that on salamander spinal cord. Yeah, so I'm leaving on Tuesday for that. So I'm very happy with how things ended up.
Oh, so proud of you, Jordan. You're doing fantastic. Saba, would you like to tell us more about what you studied?
Sure, after everybody else, it's quite intimidating. So as a side note, what's really interesting is actually hearing everyone's backgrounds and just being reminded that neuroscience is so interdisciplinary in nature. So you can approach it and you can study to be a neuroscience scientist from engineering, from computer sciences, with an MSc as a doctor. And in my case, similar to Kate and Urvashi, is I'm a pure humanities student, while Urvashi is actually in between. So I have a pure humanities background. And so it's nice actually to think that humanities can also lead into the neurosciences. So I started studying psychology, although I actually wanted to be a historian, whatever that is. And then I wanted to study English literature. And then I settled on psychology, and I thought I'd keep my options open. And I wasn't always interested in the brain. Most of the lectures I had in the field of cognitive psychology or even neuropsychology were sometimes very dry and uninspiring, but I was fortunate enough to have some really inspiring neuropsychology lectures very early on that kind of carried me through into honors, and these inspiring lectures really stuck with me. And then I got more practical experience in the field, and I was at UCT for my undergraduate and my master's in neuropsychology. And then I also went overseas and did a split site PhD in neuropsychology in London and with Cape Town. And it really expanded my horizons, because for me, neuroscience, especially coming from psychology background was almost like in a bubble. I didn't have the exposure of what neuroscience really is beyond psychology and beyond the clinical application of it as well. And then I was really lucky to come back to South Africa, to come back to this, and also to work with Kate and to try to, I guess, build this vision of this interdisciplinary neuroscience in South Africa as well. So you can, it's been really nice to hear that, and how many ways that you can actually become a neuroscientist, and from approaching it from so many different disciplines.
I think that's fantastic what you say, and 100%. I mean, I started off doing social work, and just as a side note, and moved into anthropology and then anatomy and now psychology. So it is very interdisciplinary, and I think there's great value in integrating different disciplines to really have a comprehensive and holistic understanding of the brain and the anatomy and its evolution. So thank you all so much. That was so interesting. Some of you already touched on it, but I'm interested to hear a bit more about how you found the neurosciences. How did you become interested in it? Did someone inspire you? Did you hear an interesting talk on the neurosciences?
Okay, I'll take this one first. So, like I said, when I moved into the BSc and I majored in human biology and physiology, they presented us in the human biology course, they presented us with a list of projects that you could do as your research topic. And the one that caught my eye was, it was particularly had to do with the Purkinje cells in an elephant's cerebellum, just basically doing data analysis on data that had already been collected. And from that, Dr. Busi Maseko, she really took me under her wing. She's actually been one of my co-supervisors from that third year project all the way through to my PhD. And while doing that project, we really got into chatting about what potential there is, and where to take things from there. And then she presented me in December with the honors project, where it was basically looking at modulatory systems in 2 rodent species. And yeah, the neuroscience, I got hooked from there, and she really did assist in guiding my my passion for it. And in doing so, she introduced me to my main supervisor, Dr. Paul Manger, Prof. Paul Manger. And Vicky, I'm sure he's also motivated you very much. He's an amazing individual. Yeah, he's great, and he really does fuel your ambition in neurosciences, and really does guide you into finding your specific interest, not only in your PhD, but where you want to go outside of it.
That's fantastic, Jordan. Just a side note about Professor Paul Manger. When I started my PhD, well, I went to him first with an idea on research I wanted to do on the brain. You know, I was very interested in brain evolution, and I spoke to him about starting my PhD in looking at the apes, and he was very excited, and yeah, I got my PhD from that. So he definitely is very open-minded to hearing about your passions and guides you along the way. Thank you so much, Jordan.
Go next, because might as well go next. I think, like many of the other panelists, I also fell into this field by accident. I think Sahba and Jordan both mentioned neuroscience wasn't what they set out to study. I initially wanted to go into a career in the arts, in graphic design. and I didn't get into the course that I wanted to do. Instead, I got put in a course on fine art, and I decided, no, that's not what I want either. So I registered for a bachelor's degree majoring in psychology and English. And I was particularly interested in English. I really liked it. I liked English literature, being a bit of a nerd. I liked reading all the old classics and so on. And I was thinking of doing my honors in English. And my dad said to me, oh, what you going to do with a degree, advanced degree in English? You're going to become an academic, and sort of that wasn't regarded as a suitable career, but obviously I was destined to become an academic. And then what happened was I decided almost at the last minute, I applied to do an honors in English and honors in psychology. And it was kind of a toss-up, and I decided, okay, well, let me do psychology. And while I was doing my psychology honors and masters, I got work as a research assistant for two professors, one in educational psychology, Professor Mervyn Sky, and one in the psychology department, Professor Estelle Doctor. And I worked for several years for both of them as a research assistant part-time, and that laid the foundation for my current research and my interests in neuroscience, even though neuroscience at that point, this was sort of in the mid-1990s, late 1990s, where neuroscience in South Africa didn't really exist or hadn't been formalized in any kind of way. So I was working in educational psychology for Professor Mervyn Sky, and his interests were in a researcher and theorist called Reuven Feuerstein, who had taken many of the ideas of Vygotsky around learning potential and tried to actually concretize them and find ways of actually measuring and evaluating learning potential in children. And he developed many ideas around mediated learning and so on. And that really interested me, this whole idea of cognitive potential and how important it is to try and get a sense of a person's, not only their cognitive functioning at a kind of a static level, but their potential for change and improvement over time. And it also raised in me this whole idea of how difficult it is to measure cognitive constructs. And at the same time, I was working for Estelle Doctor, and her interests were in psycholinguistics and in pure sort of cognitive psychology, where she was looking at language functioning, particularly bilingualism, and how, for instance, learning difficulties and developmental disorders, as well as injury to the brain, changes these abilities. So it was really interesting, and I think, really fortunate in that I learned from both of these professors a lot of skills that helped me today. But in particular, I learned from Professor Sky. I learned how to go about devising studies that investigate interventions, for example, and how to actually go about the whole idea of assessing cognition, applying an intervention and reassessing cognition. And then from Professor Doctor, what a name, from Professor Doctor, I learned how to design very careful cognitive experiments. And from both of them, I learned a lot around statistics and research methods, which in the cognitive neurosciences are very quantitative. So you need to be open and willing to learn those approaches, as well as academic writing and so on. And they have, I think that foundation has led me to where I am today with my interest in working memory as a potential way of tapping into cognitive potential, because to me, there's no doubt that working memory is a foundational cognitive ability that underlies virtually all, if not all, of our higher order abilities. Yeah, I think I've spoken enough.
That's fantastic, Kate. I'm learning so much about each of you. It's so interesting to hear about your background also in the arts, and it also explains why you're very interested in creativity as well. So thank you so much for sharing. Saba.
So I'll try to answer while answering the question in the chat as well about, and it was what kind of drove me to stay in academia. I'll try to do this simultaneously. So what inspired me to study the brain was Mark Solms. To be honest, I remember, and I wrote this actually for a story for this recent grant as well, is I remember clearly my first year lectures with Mark at UCT. I didn't have too much interest in the brain, and he came in and he was so enthusiastic about the brain. I'd never seen somebody love something so much. And because of that enthusiasm, you know, it just from the start made me fall in love with studying the brain. And he asked such interesting things, not like, what are the neural mechanisms? What are the cellular level? The neuropsychology of dreaming, you know, what makes us aware of the world? What is consciousness? You know, he asked the interesting questions that we all want to know, and he approached it from a scientific perspective. And as I was sharing before, like I kind of lost interest because of, you know, just uninspired not that the lectures were bad, but it didn't have the same kind of drive. I didn't have the same drive to study the brain later on. But then I kind of got reinterested in working with Mark over the years. But then that's what first inspired me to study the brain and made me interested in the brain. But what's kind of carried me through to try to develop a career in the neurosciences and even stay in academia is strong female mentorship. So if it wasn't for my supervisor in the UK, Professor Katharina Fatopoulou, my mentor at WITS, Professor Kate Cockcroft, there's no way I would have stayed in academia despite my interest. It's difficult to stay, highly competitive. You have children, you have other things that come into your life, and you know, you often have to make different choices and hard decisions. And if it wasn't for this strong female mentorship, I don't think I ever would have managed to sustain this initial interest in the brain. And then to add to the question is, you know, what made me stay in academia is that, just to say, I didn't like high school. I didn't like book learning. I found it really restrictive. But then when I came to university, it just changed my perspective on everything. I really, again, I guess maybe this is another love of mine. I just loved campus. The library just was and a possibility to learn anything. I could choose my own subjects. I could design my own courses, and I loved that kind of that feeling of this thirst for knowledge, this ability to learn, to be curious, to explore. And that's what research is, right? It's about curiosity. It's about asking questions and then finding the methods to answer them. And so even if there was, you know, clinical options or other options, to stay within this kind of like academic realm where you can not only learn, but you can actually build knowledge and inform what we already know about the brain and about behavior is really a privilege. It's really a privilege to be able to be in this field. And and I'm just really grateful for the mentorship, for the initial inspiration I received, but then later on the mentorship that's enabled me to kind of stay in this area.
Thank you so much, Saba. That was very interesting. I also, with my interest in the neurosciences, it just had me thinking, you're talking about strong females who inspire and mentor, and I definitely, my love for the neurosciences definitely stemmed from my master's supervisor, Professor Marlies Lombard, who's at UJ. And she was a phenomenal supervisor and really got me fascinated about human brain evolution. And so, yes, definitely female mentorship is so important. And thank you, Kate, for everything you've done for me as well. And yeah, and in terms of schooling, I felt the same. I sort of was a bit of an independent sort of thinker at school, and I didn't really fit in too well. And then when I went to university, I just felt like the world was my oyster. And as you said, like, you could choose whatever you wanted to study and think independently and think critically. And I think that's so valuable. So thank you so much for sharing that, Saba.
I'll go next. So I guess the question is, which is also I'm going to answer with one of that's come up in the chat. So I am a clinician. I'm not an academic yet. And as I've mentioned, you know, I also kind of stumbled into neuroscience back in the early 2000s, late 90s. It was behavioral psychology, working in corporate, and I was quite fortunate to work for a multinational in the fragrance and flavors arena. So you're looking at senses. Specifically, when I was working in fragrances, it was what smells, fragrances do to us in terms of establishing memories. And because I was in the industry, you start learning about the association between where the olfactory bulb sits in the brain and where our limbic systems sit and how this enhances our memories. So if we smell the scent of baked bread or coffee, you know, it gives us these nice warm feelings, and similarly, there are adverse feelings that we can also get. And this applies to taste as well. So I was involved in this environment, but it was more from, I guess, a bottom-up processes. How do we make decisions in terms of buying? And in fact, a lot of behavioral psychology, or as I mentioned now, behavioral neuroscience is being used in your discoveries and your momentums to do what they call, you know, all your buying to get points, your vitality points or your multiplied points is all based on some version of neuroscience. I know Momentum, for instance, has a division, a neuroeconomics division, which looks at exactly this, how people are thinking, how are they buying, what motivates them. So they're looking at rewards, you know, how do you, when you're making your decisions and you're actually healthy and this, you know, you're making good purchases and getting the rewards for that was something that was has now become commonplace. Companies like Nestle, for instance, employ people who have backgrounds in neurodevelopmental science or neuroscience in some way, because they also want you to understand what the child formula, for instance, what that does for people. So beyond the clinical environment, I come from a corporate environment, and you know, you don't actually have to be a clinician if you have good research skills. That's also great to get into the corporate arena. So I came from corporate, but then I went back into, I went straight into the clinical arena. I did neuroscience. I think Enid Skitter was one of those inspiring lecturers. There's always somebody that inspires you. And she was teaching at the Wits Plus night school at that time. And I was totally enamored with the way how exciting she made it, that, you know, and I saw great synergy, which is why I decided to go that route and subsequently became a clinician. I still am a clinician. I work with a lot of people with neurodegenerative disorders, brain injury. I do medical legal work. And I'm hoping to carry on studying and doing research, because I feel that you can never stop learning in this environment, and each person that you see, whether it's as a clinician or as a researcher, brings something novel and something new. And the more I got involved as a clinician, the more I realized the less that I know. So, which has inspired me to carry on studying. So it's definitely an area that is so diverse, and it's becoming so much more prolific, that I think if you have neuroscience as a background, somehow you can actually forge your own career as well whether it's as a clinician, whether it's as a researcher, whether it is in corporate, whether it's in HR, marketing, economics. I think that the world is your oyster if you have this sort of background. Thanks.
That's fantastic. I see Enid has joined, so welcome, Enid. Thank you. Yes, she's a phenomenal and much loved lecturer at the psychology department at WITS. And what you say about like using the skills that we develop from the research and applying it to like the business sector, it's invaluable what you can do with it. I just think about, for a while I did neuromarketing, and I used a lot of my brain imaging sort of skills and applied it to try and understand what people think about while they're watching adverts, to try and sort of like bring in people, specific target markets, to engage them and get them involved and understand what the target audience is looking for in terms of adverts. So that was fascinating. Thank you so much. Soraya?
So I came to Stellenbosch University to train as a psychiatrist, and because it was a highly research intensive department of psychiatry, I became piqued by the research that was being done by my mentors early on in training. And I had male mentors, so I didn't have perhaps the privilege or opportunity of having female mentors at the time, but I was intrigued by the research that they were conducting in understanding the neurobiology of mental disorders. So I want to maybe address the question that has come up about clinical work versus research, because as a clinician, one does experience tensions. If you don't have a post as a researcher, it can be very difficult eking out a living early in your career. But I think that research does teach one to be a better clinician. So I'm a strong proponent of clinicians engaging in research and engaging in research early in their clinical careers. Neuroscience research teaches you to be very methodical, systematic, rigorous in your clinical approach. And it teaches you to have a very inquisitive and inquiring mind. And so, as I said, I think that neuroscience research teaches you to be a better clinician, especially if you're a clinician who is, managing patients and you're concerned about their kind of mental health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Soraya. It's very true. It really does help to think systematically. I find it helps me to structure my thoughts well and to write things in a very structured manner. And it helps with so many things. It's phenomenal. Thank you all so much. That's fantastic. I'd love to hear very quickly about some of your research or area of interest, if you would like to share. Thank you so much.
So this is where everyone's waiting for someone else to talk, and we're all being very polite. So I've got a couple of projects on the go at the moment. Going back to my kind of first love in psycholinguistics, one of my areas is looking at how speaking multiple languages may change your brain. That's very broadly put, and I'm always a little bit wary because it sounds a little bit popish. I'm very wary of pop neuroscience because tends to oversimplify the complexity of matters. But we're just getting started with a EEG-based project at WITS, where we're going to sample multilingual speakers with different levels of proficiency and look at their executive functions. We're going to start off looking just at working memory, but hopefully expand it to looking at a broader range of executive functioning, because there are suggestions, there's actual physiological evidence that being highly proficient in many languages changes the way your brain is connected. And there are debates about how this influences your executive functions, your ability, for instance, to switch easily between topics, to be cognitively flexible, so to also move from one topic to another, to inhibit information that's irrelevant or distracting. So I'm quite excited about that project, because I think multilingualism is a feature of South Africans. You know, South Africans all speak at least 2 languages. Many speak 3, 4, 5 languages. So I think we've got such an interesting sample that we can draw on for this research. So that's one of my studies. I've got a whole lot of other little ones, but I know that we don't have time, so I'll pass on to somebody else to talk about this.
Thank you, Kate.
I'll try to go next just to keep slow, but I'll note as a side note, I think it's really interesting as well, being an early career researcher, in thinking about this question, how my research interests have also developed over the years. So if I want to place it in something broad, I'd say in social affective neuroscience, because I'm really interested in social processes, and also the hard question of emotion, right? Which is also, which I say to some of my students that are actually in this room, that for me, I think it's often left out of the cognitive, right? It's often not investigated enough, because they're the more difficult, more abstract questions, which is why I like them. And initially, because I started off doing more clinical work, a lot of my questions were driven by what I saw in brain injury. And then little by little, it became it was more informed, not just by clinical work, but it was more informed by theory. So what's actually happening in the field. So my main kind of interest is in the study of self-consciousness. So how do we become aware of ourselves in the world? And how do we then become aware of other people, other minds? How do we engage in these abstract mentalization processes? And I first started by looking at this through brain injury. So when something goes wrong in the brain, you lose some of these almost intrinsic abilities. And then in my postdoctoral research, I looked at it from the other spectrum, from a developmental perspective. So in infancy and in early childhood, how do we develop the sense of self? How do we then develop a sense of other people in terms of becoming aware of other minds, but also empathy? And then looking at all of these kind of questions, what's really behind it as well is this idea of brain plasticity, that we're not hardwired, we're actually soft wired. And how does the brain then kind of change and reorganize itself over time? If it's in childhood itself, or maybe in adolescence, which is a really interesting, it's a period that I'm becoming more and more interested in, because there's just so much going on in terms of changes in how we understand ourselves and others, but also changes in the brain. There's so much happening in terms of brain plasticity, but also then after brain injury. So how do we actually reorganize our cognition, but as well as the way we understand ourselves and understand other people after brain injury? And then, yeah, over time, I think I've tried to meddle in some new methodologies. So I did some basic training in neuroimaging and MRI and fMRI research. That is always nice. Methodologies, I have to say, aren't research questions. They're just ways of looking at your research questions. And I'm hoping to do more with Kate and with Vicky and with some new EEG studies, But my new kind of love that we're hoping to do with the Department of Physiology at WIT is virtual reality experiments. So trying to do real immersive embodiment experiences and looking at how this can actually change some of our beliefs and some of our behaviors. So it's always nice to see these new, as Kate was saying, there's so many it's a rapidly advancing field, and the methodologies used are really fast changing. So it's nice to be able to keep up to date and try to use all of these new techniques to answer some age-old questions.
It's really fascinating using VR. It's a very, very innovative approach. I'm very excited to hear more about the research as it progresses. And I'm very interested to talk to you probably at a later stage about more of the developmental research that's been done on self as a mom. You know, that sounds very interesting. Thank you so much, Saba.
So my research, I'm not a clinician. I originally wanted to study medicine when I first was leaving high school. But through how all my paths have ended up, I found it that my passion lies more on the basic science side. So when you are looking in clinical studies, you need the basic science in terms of animal models, and then translate that information to do your clinical studies. So my passion now is translational work. So my PhD, I basically looked at doing the gross anatomy, because I'm a neuroanatomist, the gross anatomy of primate brains, the white matter neurons, not really looking at the clinical implications as such, more putting the backbone into the research, where when they do eventually look at the clinical aspects, they have a decent perspective on where the distribution of the neurons lie, what specific markers they contain, that type of thing. So that was my PhD. My postdoc that I'm going to go do is on salamander spinal cords. So with salamanders, they're the only tetrapod, so four-legged animal, that the spinal cord can regenerate when completely transected. So basically, I'm going to be looking at different cell populations within that spinal cord to see how these reconnections sort of form, and then bringing my engineering side of things. We are working with engineering faculty in Sweden, where they're doing the robotics side. So there's a lot of salamander robotics happening, and we just need the backbone, like I said, of what these cells are doing and how they are reforming. So yeah, so I have moved from wanting to study medicine, and through all the research projects that I've done throughout the studying process to get to where I am now, I've moved away from that, and I'm now more focused on the translational aspects before the clinical studies happen.
Thanks, Jordan. Just a quick question. What kind of methods will you be using for your postdoctoral research? And does it differ to some of the other methods that you've used in the past?
So my methods previously, I used immunohistochemistry and serology to just basically count cell populations. But for this, there's a lot more emphasis on electrophysiological techniques and calcium imaging to actually see how the connections are reforming and what exactly they are reconnecting to.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jordan.
Sorry, I just forgot to unmute. Just quickly, as I mentioned, I'm a clinician, not an academic yet, but I have been working with Saba on, I have a specific interest in capacity, mental capacity, because we're working a whole lot more with people with traumatic brain injuries or dementia, or even now, quite interestingly, people that have studied, or not studied, have been afflicted with long COVID. We suspect that they, especially where there's been severe effects of COVID, people have been in ICU for more than 7 days. We suspect that there would be some neurocognitive deficits and how this would impact on their functioning, their rehabilitation. This is all very exciting. So as a clinician, I'm really interested in where that happens, what sort of capacity has been lost, and how can we support people going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting to see the general impact that the pandemic has had on our lives. And with that, I'd love to hear a little bit more. I'd like to actually ask Soraya more about post-traumatic stress in relation to the pandemic. And if she could elaborate on what she has been finding in her research in that regard. Thanks.
Thank you. So much of that research is still ongoing, but what we have data on currently is data from sort of general population studies. And I've been fortunate to be involved in 2 multinational studies that were started early in the pandemic. And both studies have tracked the mental health and, psychosocial experiences of men, women, children in the general population. And what we do see mirrors, what we do see in South Africa mirrors, what is seen in many, many countries around the world. And that is that early in the pandemic, very high rates of common mental health problems like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. A lot of that post-traumatic stress is directly linked to experiences of the pandemic, experiences of lockdown, witnessing, having sort of close experience of death and or suffering. And many of the individuals who report psychological distress early on continue to experience distress over time. And what is also, I think, very concerning is that, among healthcare workers, especially frontline healthcare workers, there are much higher rates of depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder relative to the general population. Now, this is what we expected because based on previous pandemics, the Ebola pandemic, the H1N1, the previous SARS pandemic in 2003, this was the very same picture, that frontline workers had very high rates of mental health problems, and they persisted for up to 2 years post those pandemics. And, early intervention is key, and maybe I can speak about clinical experience, but stemming from that clinical experience, some research that we've embarked on. We've just completed a pilot study focusing on frontline clinicians using a mobile application as an intervention. So mobile application that is based on sort of cognitive behavioral principles to help. It's essentially an app for anyone, but we have tested it in a small sample of clinicians, and we're just about completing the pilot study, and then we'll go on to doing a full trial comparing clinicians who use the app and then following them up over time relative to clinicians who are waitlisted. Thank you.
Well, that's very interesting research. Thank you. Please keep us posted on that. That sounds very very much needed and very interesting. I'd like to ask you all, I see I want to go to the Q&As soon. Just would like to ask you all, what advice would you give to women in particular who are interested in studying or pursuing careers in the neurosciences?
I've answered that in one of the chats, but I really, for myself, I found a lot of benefits of when I started studying neuroscience or got interested in it. I started attending, well, at that time it was SACNA, the South African Clinical Neuropsych Association meetings, which used to be held once a month. It still is. It was a great opportunity to interact with people, to understand what they were talking about. Most of the times, though, I attended those talks and I was clueless about what they were talking about. But it was a really unique and a great opportunity for me to network with people, to understand actually where I wanted to go, whether I really wanted to be a clinician, or whether I wanted to follow some other direction of neuroscience. So that was really brilliant. And as I said, many organizations, the South African Neuroscience Association, the SAISA, Saba has posted a couple of other links, because there are so many organizations now that are doing this online, so you can have access to international research and you can start deciding, okay, this is for me, this is the direction I want to go in, because as you can see, neuroscience is so diverse. There's, you know, from clinician to corporate to education. It's such a broad field. There's pretty much wherever you want to take it is where you can go. So I think that, you know, the more different types of organizations and seminars you can attend, the better for you while you're still studying. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, that's very important. And I'd just like to ask the question quickly. Oh, sorry. I'd just like to ask the question quickly. How do you, especially the young moms like Saba, how do you find a balance with the work-life balance?
Thanks, Vicky. I'll try to bring those two together. So for the aspiring female neuroscientists, also for the men, but for the females especially, I'm going to say that it's hard. I'm not going to lie, especially with what Vicky's talking about. You know, your peak career often corresponds with the time you have kids, right? And I had my first child as soon as I finished my PhD. I literally received my PhD corrections the day my daughter was born. I don't know why I was checking my emails, but I did. And it was difficult. It was really difficult for me to, you know, you can still work, of course, and have kids, but you often have to, like, you know, sacrifice a little bit. Like, you can't travel for international conferences, or maybe, you know, you have to prioritize a little bit. And it was hard to watch other friends that finished PhDs at the same time, and, you know, they were starting these cool, exciting, like, postdoctoral fellowships, and you often, it's a struggle, like, to balance both. And I often feel guilty, like every day I feel guilty for not being a better mother, for not putting more time for my kids, but then I feel guilty for not putting more time for my work and giving more time for my students. So I think you will have these, like, conflicting feelings often that are really hard. But like I said before, having strong female mentors and role models, so even if your supervisors are men, or which are also great, I've also had male supervisors, try to speak to other women for support and for inspiration. And although it's hard, you can still do it, and you're paving the way for other women. I think, like, my PhD supervisor was a female, like I said, and she actually had a baby during my PhD, and that really stood out for me as a strong example of how you can still kind of have, like, a really successful competitive career while having kids, even if you have to, you're a bit slower to publish a few papers, or you you don't have as many grants as you'd like to at the beginning, it's also important to focus on your kids. And just to say that I did a postdoctoral fellowship in early childhood development while I was like having my children basically. And so that added to the guilt, right? Like, oh, I should be spending more time with my kids, or should I? But then I had work pressure. It was really hard. These feelings are kind of there. And I don't want to take up too much time, but what I will also say is that as a female and as a racial and cultural minority, as a religious minority, and I even see like my discipline as being almost like inferior, not inferior, but I feel like when I'm in the space with some really hardcore like computational neuroscientists coming from a psychology humanities background, all of these things make me suffer from the imposter syndrome all the time. I often feel that I'm just not good enough to be called a neuroscientist, although you have the qualifications and experience. I still feel like an imposter in so many spaces, and that's something that I just I would guard against as female neuroscientists, or even neuroscientists coming from South Africa, and just know that you are good enough, that you are making a contribution, even if you have these feelings, to just keep at it, no matter how hard it is, and no matter how many of these conflicting feelings that you have.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much, Saba. Everything you expressed, I feel that way as well. I just as a quick side note, while I was finishing, while I started my PhD, I had my first child, and then I had my second child. I think it was just after I finished my PhD, and I was also doing corrections as well. So I had a similar experience. And thank you all so much for being part of the panel, and you've been incredible. I'd love to open it up to the listeners to either put comments on the chat. I see that there have already been some comments. Yes, if you want to put something in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand and you can ask directly. Thank you.
Vicky, sorry, before we go to the chat, I hope it's okay to ask. I was actually also hoping for that last question to maybe hear from the more I guess like from Kate and Soraya, who have both been such strong female mentors. if as we're waiting for questions to come in, I don't know if they want to actually share. No pressure. I'd really like to hear from them as well, because they've come through this age of having kids, and and also maybe feeling or suffering from the imposter syndrome. But if they have anything to add, I know I'd like to hear from them. So that's my question.
That's great. Thank you, Sabs.
I'm happy to go first. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to offer you any sage advice, but I think I realized very early on that it was going to be so much more difficult as a woman, proving myself to my colleagues and to my supervisors and to my mentors at the time. But 21 years later, I don't regret having to have worked harder, well, subjectively thinking that I've had to work harder. I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a work-life balance. I think that it's something that is so individual, and I think it's about finding one's own level of comfort with juggling one's work and family obligations. And I think it's it's different for every woman pursuing a research career. And it is more challenging, I think, working, in South Africa and working sort of in the deep South, even if you have strong collaborations, you have the opportunity, well, pre-COVID, you had the opportunity to travel and network extensively. I still think that, kind of in my ripe old age, I'm realizing that, there are disadvantages, and yet at the same time, there are so many research opportunities, so many exciting opportunities to working, in this wonderful country that we live in. So I know I haven't really addressed your question, but I wouldn't want to do anything else, and I'm just encouraged by all of the young neuroscientists on the panel, because as you're telling your stories, I'm thinking, we are such a diverse group, and yet we're all neuroscientists, and that's how we see ourselves. We're so diverse in terms of our educational backgrounds, our cultural backgrounds, our research experiences, our kind of research niche areas, and at the same time, I think there are so many commonalities that bring us together as women neuroscientists. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Soraya. Kate, sorry to put you on the spot.
No. Hello. I was just thinking while Soraya was speaking, what advice I would give to my younger self, perhaps. And on Sahba's question, I think, some of the key things that I've learned along the way, and one I think does particularly apply to women, but the others are more general for anyone in thinking of a career in the neurosciences. One is it's okay to say no to things. I think it's particularly difficult for women. We are socialized to, be amenable and always available and so on. And I think many women find it difficult to say no, and we end up overcommitting. And, that is incredibly stressful when you've got family commitments on top of your work commitments. So I would say, it's okay to say no. And there are ways of saying no that can be quite pleasant. You don't have to be, unpleasant in the way that you say no to things. Some of the other quick tips, one, and it relates to a question someone posted on the chat, which is about getting experience and so on. My advice would be flexible. There aren't loads of opportunities in the neurosciences for someone who's just starting out in South Africa. You have to take what arises. So there may be a research assistant post in anthropology, and I would say go for it, because the nice thing about neuroscience is it interlinks with virtually every discipline. So we're interested in brain behavior relations. You can bring that in from any discipline. So any experience you get doing research, for instance, in any other discipline is going to stand you in good stead. So I would say, go in with an open mind. Don't go in being very structured and rigid in the sense that I'm only going to take work experience in one direction. And one of the other things, I think it just applies to life generally, but compare down rather than up. I think it can be very demoralizing in a way if you're starting off in your career and you're trying to compare yourself to someone who's got 20 years experience. So it's good to have a mentor who can help guide you, but don't expect when you're starting out in your career to have the same achievements and to have the same CV and so on that seasoned academics and researchers have, and which took them 20 years. Because this was a problem I had when I started out. I would look at the top names in my field and I think, oh my goodness, it's so overwhelming. Their CV is a mile long and they've done all these courses and they're just so impressive. I can never be like that. So I think it's important to put yourself in context and compare, downwards or to people who are in a similar position to you to keep your sanity. And then I think a final thing that's been mentioned indirectly by many people here is networking is very important. Essentially, as an academic, as a neuroscientist, you're going to be working either as a clinician, a researcher, or an academic, and all possibly across all three of those areas. And so it's very important to build up a network of people who you can turn to in your area, bearing in mind that those relationships work on a quid pro quo kind of basis. So you can't always be a taker. You have to give. Sometimes you give, sometimes you take. But it's very important to build up a network of people who you can trust and who you can turn to when you need support and so on. Yeah, I think that's it from me.
Thank you. That's really fantastic advice, Kate. Thank you so much. Just to get to some of the questions in the chat, some of which have been answered. Anyways, I will sort of mention quickly that someone asked for tips on books that are not sort of pop neuropsychology or neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. I think Kate or Saba mentioned the Cognitive Neuroscience book by Jamie Ward. It's one of the books that Kate and Saba and Enid use for the honors course in cognitive neuroscience, and it's a really good introductory book for those who are interested. And yes, Vashi mentions Oliver Sacks, also fantastic. I actually named my son after Oliver Sacks, so I really love his books. Okay, super. Let's have a quick look at some of the other questions. There's a comment just saying, thank you, Saba. Imposter syndrome is always the worst. It's nice to know that we're not alone. I think a lot of people feel that way. So thanks for sharing that, Saba. There's a question from Kirsten saying, are there any scholarships or bursaries available for Masters or PhD in neuroscience available in South Africa or overseas? And how does one go about finding this funding? Does someone want to answer that?
Me again. So there aren't really scholarships exclusively for neuroscience research in South Africa. What I suggest you do is you look at the National Research Foundation website. They offer scholarships for master's study and across all disciplines. So they are probably the foremost provider of scholarships for students. And then you must remember that most universities offer what are called, at Wits, they call them postgraduate merit awards. So if you did particularly well in, I think that there's a mark requirement, I know that's, I think it's 70% or above average in your honors, you would qualify for that at Wits, and that pays your fees and gives a stipend. And then there are a few other places such as the Wellcome Trust that offers master's scholarships, and they're also Commonwealth bursaries. Those are for students who are going to often study overseas in the UK, but that come from a Commonwealth country like South Africa. So you could look at any of those options. Perhaps other people have some other suggestions as well.
Just to bounce off what Kate was saying, just to say that for local ones, the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust has really great kind of funding opportunities. But I'm also just listening to Jordan's experience now and going as a postdoc, and Professor Sadat's experience in her initial career, how important it was for her to actually go overseas. And my own experience in my PhD to actually have international exposure. We have great neuroscientists in South Africa, but I think as a part of building our neurosciences as a discipline and also these subdisciplines, we need international exposure. We need training from other universities. So don't limit yourself just to South Africa. Think about, like what Kate was saying, these Commonwealth split-type scholarships, Fulbright scholarships, the Rhodes Scholarship, the Nelson Mandela Rhodes Scholarship, that offers you an opportunity to have your local roots and even maybe do your research in a South African context, but also get training from elsewhere and bring them back to South Africa as well. And just to say, my experience with these international funders is that they love South African students. The world wants to hear from you. So So I think it's great. I think it'd be good for neuroscience in South Africa for us to kind of build capacity outside and bring it back. But it's also good for you. I think somebody in the chat mentioned that she was so inspired by Enid and Kate during her studies, and then she went to do an MSc at King's, and I'm not sure what you're doing afterwards, but hopefully you'll come and share your knowledge here. So and there are a lot of great international funding opportunities for South African students specifically.
Great, thank you so much, Saba. I see all the questions in the chat were answered. So thank you to all the panelists, and also to Sizwe Zondo for answering questions as well. Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you all for joining today. I'd just like to thank all the listeners for joining the webinar series today. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining. And it's been absolutely fantastic. And I would love it if you joined us for the second part of our webinar series of Inspiring South African Women of Neuroscience, which will start today at 3 and finish at 4:15. It would be great to have you there as well. And if you need details about it, please send me an email and I'll respond with the link. My email address is victoria.williams@wits.ac.za. And yes, and at Wits Neural, please can you visit our website, have a look at some of the research we're involved in, and stay in touch with our upcoming events and that kind of stuff. You can visit us at www.witsneural.co.za. Or is it .com? Sorry, Saba, I think it's .com. Yes, there we go. Saba's put it up for us. www.witsneural.com. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoyed it and it was informative. Thanks so much. See you all later. Thanks. Bye.